Imagine living in constant fear, where your home becomes a prison and your father the jailer whole absurd them physically and mentally. In a shocking case that gripped Russia, three sisters made a desperate choice that would change their lives forever. This is the story of the Katurian sisters, victims turned defendants in a tale of survival, justice, and the darkest corners of family life. What drove these young sisters to commit the unthinkable act against their own father? How did a seemingly devout and religious man hide such dark secrets from the outside world? Why did the neighbors and teachers, aware of the abuse, choose to remain silent? What startling evidence did investigators uncover that changed the course of the trial? Will the sisters find justice, or will they be punished for trying to save their own lives? Tune in to uncover the full story and the twists that kept an entire nation on edge. On July 28, 2018, police arrested sisters Christina Angelina and Maria Katurian, and they never imagined the huge public outrage that would follow, dividing opinions in Russia. Some compare it to the impact of the O.J. Simpson case in the United States. The story of the Katurian sisters and their father Michael begins in Azerbaijan, where the patriarch was born in 1962. Coming from a conservative Armenian family with strong ties to the Orthodox Church and Caucasian customs, they were forced to leave their country due to a historical event in February 1988. The Supreme Soviet of Nagorno-Karabakh requested to join the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, but Azerbaijan rejected the decision, leading to protests in both countries. Ethnic tensions and demonstrations led to violent clashes in Sumgait and Baku, where the Armenian population was attacked. Michael fled Baku with his family to avoid violence. They arrived in Moscow with plans to immigrate to America, but due to paperwork and family matters, they stayed in the Russian capital. In 1996, in Moscow, he met Aurelia Dunduk, who later became his wife and mother of his children. Aurelia and Michael's marriage was not exactly a fairy tale. As Aurelia tells it, on the very day of the wedding, just before the ceremony, Michael hit her. Despite the tears, they went and got married. This situation continued for 20 years. Michael did not restrain himself even in front of relatives or strangers, feeling no shame for his violence. The Katurian family lived in a two-room apartment with Michael's mother, sister, and nephew. 10 people shared the same space. Despite appearing to be pious and following strict religious rules, Michael was superstitious, imposing severe rules on the family, especially on his wife, whom he forbade to work and restricted from going out. The family shared Michael's patriarchal views, arguing that Aurelia should endure beatings as a good wife. In this environment, the family grew up. Aurelia, at the age of 19, became pregnant with their first child, Sergei. In 1999, Christina was born. A year later, Angelina and in 2001 Maria became the first to suffer Michael's assault. Sergei was tormented and abused under educational pretexts, and when he graduated at 16, Michael pushed him out of the house. In 2015, he not only expelled Ilya, but he also prevented her from seeing her daughters, threatening her with death if she tried. Terrified, Aurelia fled knowing her husband's violence and convinced that he would make good on his threats. For 2 decades, she endured beatings and abuse from Michael. When she had the guts to contact the authorities for help, she was disregarded in a moment of desperation. She went so far as to cut herself with a hunting knife he owned. Even so, no one did anything to help her following the absence of the eldest son. Michael's violence was turned against his daughters, on whom he imposed a series of unbearable tasks. He regularly beat them and subjected them to cruel treatment that included forcing them to be intimate. He demanded that they always be available to his requests and come at the first call. He had a special bell that he rang, and as soon as they heard it they had to run immediately to attend to him regardless of whether it was day or night, and execute as he commanded, bringing water, food, and other things. As a result of these happenings, Christina, one of the sisters, attempted suicide but was resuscitated by the medics. It is unclear if it was for fear of being told of her acts or for the pure enjoyment of treating them as his property. The father was isolating them, which was detrimental to the girls' schooling. Maria and Angelina attended the same grade, but in recent years, they were practically never allowed to go to school since their father ordered them to care for him. As the sisters later recounted, their father constantly threatened them with various weapons. He also installed a camera so he could watch them when he was not present at home. Among the horrible insanities to which the subject subjected his 3 daughters, one example was forcing them to eat the family dog's hair. This was happening in the 21st century, and everyone was watching. Neighbors, teachers, daughters' friends, and even our parents witnessed how Michael treated them badly. In 2017, due to pressure from the Russian Orthodox Church and those upholding traditional values, the parliament passed the slapping law. This law removed the criminalization of domestic violence, considering it only an administrative offense. Additionally, Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a decree that reduced sanctions against domestic violence, punishing it only with fines. In this context, it was not surprising that when the psychologist tried to talk to the girl's father, Michael threatened him, telling him not to interfere in family affairs. By 2018, the Katurian sisters were practically prisoners at home, suffering physical and mental abuse from their father. Their mother and brother knew nothing, but it was easy to tell from what the 2 of them experienced before they were kicked out. The worst part was that their grandmother and paternal family accepted everything as normal, thinking that Michael was protecting them to lead an honorable life. On the evening of July 27, 2018, Michael returned home from treatment at the Sontsivo Psychiatric and Neurological Center. Entering his apartment, he was angry about alleged expenses and disorder, blaming his daughters. He called them one by one, locked them in a room, and sprayed pepper spray in their faces. The substance gave Christina such a severe asthma attack that she fainted. After punishing his daughters, Michael went to sleep on a couch. It was at that moment that Angelina and Maria decided that this day would be the last day they would endure the abuse. At night, while their father slept on the couch, Angelina, 18, sneaked up and hit him over the head with a hammer, followed by Maria, 17, who wounded him with a hunting tool with which he often threatened them. But Michael was as strong as a bull. He woke up, tried to defend himself, and attempted to leave the apartment. Christina, the oldest of the 3 at 19, upon hearing the commotion and seeing what was happening, took the same can of pepper spray that her father had used and sprayed it in his face to prevent him from catching one of her sisters. This marked the climax of the Katurian family's ongoing struggle. Angelina took Maria's knife and gave the final blow to the father who had mistreated them until that moment. The reaction of one of the sisters after the crime was recorded in a video. Following that, the 3 girls cut their arms with a knife to simulate defense as if their father had attacked them. When they arrived at the building in ALU Fevko Moscow, the autopsy revealed Mel's body with multiple knife wounds as well as cuts. There was everything: a knife, hammer, crossbow, and rifle. 2 air pistols. A traumatic weapon, 16 bullets and 16 darts. The traumatic weapons fired rubber and pepper shells cause a lot of pain but do not lead to death. The next day Christina, Angelina and Maria, his 3 daughters, were arrested and accused of being responsible for their father's death. During interrogation they admitted to the crime. According to what they told, Male beat them, humiliated them and subjected them to moral and sexual abuse over the years. The motive, according to the investigators' report, was a very strained personal relationship as the father caused them moral suffering for a long time. On July 29, the trio was charged with murder without aggravating circumstances. Sisters Christina, Angelina and Maria Katurian, they called their father an evil sex addict. They also said he subjected them to all kinds of cruel and inhuman treatments systematically, in addition to using them as slaves for years. During the investigation also testified about the more than 10 incidents of sexual violence against them of which they were aware. A medical examination confirmed that all 3 had injuries resulting from sexual abuse. The youngest of the sisters, Maria, was declared insane at the time of the facts and sent for mandatory medical treatment. The judge extended the jail sentence for another 72 hours, according to a court spokesman. During the trial, investigators upgraded the charges from simple murder to murder under Article 105.2 of the Russian Criminal Code, making the expected punishment more severe. On July 31, representatives of the Moscow Public Surveillance Commission visited the sisters in a pre-trial detention center. The girls complained that after the arrest, their legal rights were violated by the police. According to what they told the commission, their rights were never explained to them, and testimony was taken without the presence and advice of their lawyers. In early August, the investigation examined the murder weapons and questioned relatives and friends of the defendants. Investigators also received copies of videos from surveillance cameras at the Katurian home and concluded that the sisters acted together, and that the younger sister Maria stabbed her father at least 35 times for their legal representatives. The sisters lived in an environment of constant threat to their own lives as they were practically isolated from the outside world by their father's orders. They were convinced that it was impossible to get outside help, which made the situation desperate, so their actions were aimed at stopping the inevitable violence committed against them, according to the girls' defense team. The act was the result of necessary self-defense. On August 2, the Ostankino Court of Moscow extended the remand for another 2 months. 4 days later, the Central Office of the Investigative Commission took over the case. Russian Human Rights Commissioner Tatiana Moskova said the court decision was too harsh, and the defense appealed the sentence. In a paradox of life in pre-trial detention, the defendants were given the opportunity to study and talk to a psychologist for counseling, which their father had forbidden them to do at home. In mid-August, the investigation recognized Michael's immoral actions towards his daughters and confirmed psychological and sexual abuse. In early September, following a mental health examination, it was recognized that the younger sister was unaware of his actions and she was transferred to the psychiatric ward of Butica prison. According to the evaluation, the other 2 sisters were mentally healthy, but experts diagnosed them with battered woman syndrome. Although the court and the Russian media gave various versions of what happened, but all agreed that the girls had long suffered beatings and forbidden carnal acts from their father. As the judicial process progressed, public opinion was learning thanks to the work of journalists of all the hell experienced by the 3 sisters since their childhood. The media began to publish audio recordings and correspondence from the girls, proving that they suffered violence of all kinds at the hands of that the sisters acted this way because of their difficult emotional state. In text messages obtained from the male's phone and posted on social media by one of the attorneys, it was evident that the father threatened to take their lives and force intimacy not only on them but also on their mother. In an April 2018 text message, he specifically threatened them that he would beat and kill them. In the message he accused them of having sex with a friend, insulted them by calling. During the investigation, a video of the sisters' repeated abuse was released. In it, Michael was clearly seen screaming at and hitting his daughters because he considered the apartment a mess. It was Michael himself who recorded everything. The complaint made by the 3 lawyers defending the sisters indicated that organizations did not take necessary measures after receiving complaints about Michael from the teachers at the sisters' school. It was known that Michael was repeatedly reported to the police, but after his death, law enforcement officials denied receiving such reports both through the hotline and the local police station. The girl's mother, Aurelia, suspected that the police inaction was due to Michael's close ties to local police chiefs. Later, whistleblowers from the Russian investigative newspaper Nova Gazeta confirmed this information. They emphasized that in Russia, domestic violence is rarely discussed in public, and human rights advocates mentioned that police often ignore complaints. Activists pointed out that women face harsh prison sentences if they commit violent crimes while defending themselves against an aggressor. In the case of the 3 sisters, lawyers and activists argued that they were forced to act to save their lives and blamed poor legal protections for abuse victims in the country, where penalties for domestic violence have been softened in recent years. They noted that this left victims with only one option: the girls defended themselves. However, not everyone believed in their innocence. In the more conservative Russian society, there was a strong backlash. Surprisingly, the teenage girls did not have the backing of their own family. Several of Michael's relatives defended him and branded the girls as liars. They argued that the alleged acts of domestic violence were simply the father's responses to their provocations. According to the relatives, they went so far as to say that the girls took his life for money, accusing them of having mercenary motives, despite the fact that the defendants renounced their father's inheritance. In addition, the grandmother cancelled Christina's registration in the apartment. The girl's cousin stated that they lied about the beatings to defend their father. One of the aunts, Naira, assured that no evidence of sexual violence against the adolescents was found. According to her statement, medical tests showed that 2 of the 3 were virgins, and for the one who supposedly was not, the aunt pointed out that she had a secret boyfriend. Because of this perspective on the facts, the sister's uncle, together with his wife Naira, requested and was granted recognition as a victim in the investigation. The Katurian sisters' court case provoked a strong public reaction and was repeatedly analyzed and discussed on state television channels. In January, the prosecutor's office confirmed the allegations made by the defense that the girls had suffered beatings, constant humiliation, threats, and abuse, including physical and sexual violence. Prosecutors later asked the investigative committee to reclassify the case from premeditated murder to necessary self-defense. One of the lawyers, Paran, told state news agency TASS at the time that this basically meant the end of the criminal investigation against the sisters, who faced up to 20 years in prison for premeditated murder. However, to everyone's surprise, Victor Grimm, the same prosecutor who recommended reducing the severity of the case, made an unexpected decision in May. They confirmed that they would impose premeditated murder charges against the sisters without explaining the drastic change. Marita Tian, who joined the defense and had experience in domestic abuse cases, linked the change by prosecutor Victor to a growing trend of disregard for human rights, especially after the controversial amendments to the Russian constitution following the July 1 referendum. On June 14, 2019, they increased the charges to premeditated murder committed by a group of persons or as a result of a conspiracy, with sentences of 8 to 20 years in prison. The prosecution indicated unlawful acts of violence committed by the father as the motive for the murder. In response, the lawyers filed complaints with the chairman of the investigative committee, Alexander Bastrikin, insisting that the investigation should recognize self-defense as the main motive. For their part, the investigators asked to extend the sisters' ban on using the internet, communicating with relatives, and talking to the media for another month. On June 26, the request was accepted and the ban was extended until July 28, then further extended. The case, quite prominent in the media, provoked a massive public outcry, with activists defending the sisters. There were major demonstrations in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities in their support. Activists organized many demonstrations calling on the authorities to change the classification of the case. The young women also received support from singers, artists, journalists, and non-governmental organizations. Figures such as former presidential candidate Ksenia Sobchak and System of a Down singer Serge Tankian called for clemency for the sisters. However, activists from the conservative Russian organization Men's State opposed the sisters' march, considering them cold-blooded criminals. 4 people were arrested for rioting, 3 of them male members of Men's State. The public outcry was due to the case highlighting the shortcomings of the Russian judicial system. In the media and on social networks, people actively debated the ethics of the judicial process. Supporters of the Katurian sisters launched a petition to the investigative committee to stop the criminal proceedings. As of June 2019, more than 115,000 people had signed the petition. At the same time, many criticized the apparent happiness shown by the sisters in photos on social networks. At first, public pressure appeared to impact some events in the case. In an early defense development on July 11, it was reported that the investigative committee planned to charge Michael posthumously with torture, violent acts of a sexual nature, and forced participation in sexual acts. However, in late 2019, despite discovering that the 3 sisters were abused and mistreated by their own father, the Commission of Inquiry announced charges of premeditated murder. Prosecutors argued that Michael's murder was clearly premeditated because he was asleep and the sisters coordinated the attack by allegedly stealing the knife they had been using since the morning. The sisters' lawyers insisted that the Russian criminal code allows self-defense not only in situations of immediate aggression but also in cases of ongoing crime. A 2019 poll by Levada Center found that 47% of Russian women and 33% of men considered the Katurian sisters' actions justified. Another poll by Mediazona, a Russian media outlet that covers justice and prisons, showed that nearly 80% of Russian women imprisoned for premeditated murder between 2016 and 2018 were trying to protect themselves from an abuser. In early 2020, the Deputy Prosecutor General reportedly refused to sign an indictment against the sisters, suggesting that investigators should reclassify the charges from murder to necessary self-defense. Although investigators objected, Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika insisted on the order and stressed the need for additional psychological and psychiatric evaluations. By May 13 of that year, an additional investigation was completed and the murder charges still stood. In July, the Prosecutor General's office approved the indictment. After a long and convoluted pre-trial investigation, the trial began in Moscow on July 31. The two older sisters, Christina and Angelina, were tried in the same trial. Maria, who was a minor at the time of the crime, was charged after her 18th birthday. At the beginning of the trial, the prosecution requested that the defendants be prohibited for at least 6 months from accessing the Internet, making statements to the press, having contact with trial participants, and participating in public events, such as demonstrations in support of the defendants. In August 2020, when the case reached the Moscow City Court, a motion by Christina and Angelina's lawyers to have the case heard by a jury was granted. Maria was declared unfit to stand trial, and prosecutors were expected to request medical treatment for her in a separate trial. Surprisingly, on December 4, 2020, the Bauman court in Moscow pronounced the investigators' reluctance to file a criminal prosecution against Mel Katurian unconstitutional, and such proceedings were to be initiated. Another event resulting from the Bauman court judgment occurred in early February 2021. The Moscow City Court returned the case against Angelina and Christina to the prosecutors until their father's actions obtained a legal qualification in March. The posthumous case against Mel was opened in the Buy District Court of Moscow on charges of sexual assault, sexual coercion, and causing torment. In the same process, the three sisters were recognized as victims. Experts during the investigation stated that the accused manipulated people through he disseminated audiovisual material with explicit intimate images of his own daughters. A report by the Serbsky Institute for Psychological, Psychiatric, and Medical Examinations concluded that the father was a child sex offender with sexual preferences directed at his daughters. However, a lawyer representing the deceased Olga Kova requested the dismissal of the statutory rape charges due to the lack of confirming biological traces on that occasion. He also said that according to his criteria, the duty of the investigation was to prove that it was Mel who sent this video, but it was not done. On May 29, 2022, it was reported that the investigation against Mel was over, and he was charged with sexual violence, assault and distribution of sexually explicit material. All of Mel's actions that were exposed at the trial were chilling, considering that the target of his cruelty was his own daughters, but perhaps one of the most shocking, and it was decided that the ongoing maltreatment caused severe damage to the physical and emotional health of his daughters. This finding opened the possibility of exonerating the three sisters. After a lengthy legal process, they were finally recognized as victims, which gave them hope of regaining their freedom because the crime could be reclassified as self-defense. However, a final verdict has not yet been issued in the Mel trial. As of early October 2023, Christina and Angelina were still under house arrest, with their trial on hold pending the conclusion of their father's trial. Women's rights advocates argue that the sisters need psychological rehabilitation rather than a prison sentence. Recently, a new psychiatric evaluation of the trio emerged, potentially leading to the dropping of charges against all the sisters. The evaluation reveals that the sisters were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder at the time of the events. Meanwhile, the Korans await sentencing, and the defense lawyers seek to have the case reviewed by the judiciary to set a precedent in jurisprudence on the legitimate defense of abuse victims in Russia. So far, it is clear that the case of the Katurian sisters has generated a strong public reaction. For several months, all TV channels in Russia discussed the manner of the abusive father's death. The role of the Moscow police was also heavily criticized for failing to take action against Mel following allegations of physical violence made by his ex-wife. It was revealed that police officers usually treat domestic violence as a family problem and provide little or no help to the victims. The Katurian case quickly became a cause célèbre for human rights groups fighting to pass a law to protect domestic abuse victims. And well, dear viewer, this concludes today's crime story. I would be very interested to know your opinion, so please leave it in the comments of the video.